Coming up.
From an economist perspective, do you think that the capital gains changes proposed by the Liberal government will lead to more or less investment in home building?
You said, and I quote here, and yet we have measures like this that are clearly punitive to investment in Canada. You're talking about capital gains. So it is a big change. And the signal probably doesn't sit well with a lot of folks in terms of what it means for competitiveness and agility of Canada's landscape. Do you still agree with those comments?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And at this time, I'd like to move the following motion. That the committee order a fully redacted copy, the government's economic analysis on the impact of the federal fuel charge and the output-based pricing system, referred as reference information request IR 0776.
I move that we adjourn debate.
Hey, there's
This guy's garage. Like and subscribe.
Perhaps I'll start with you, Ms. Young. The government of Canada announced in its budget that it's going to be increasing the capital gains inclusion rate from 50% to 66 and 2/3%. They've just introduced legislation to make that happen this morning, or yesterday morning. From an economist perspective, do you think that the capital gains changes proposed by the Liberal government will lead to more or less investment in home building?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. Maybe what I haven't seen details of the legislation, so maybe what I will talk more broadly about is the impact of the costs of some of the headwinds to supply right now, and so very obviously a big one right now are high interest rates. So that has been adding.
I hate to interrupt, but I have a fairly focused issue that I'd like to try and get a response on. The government has said they're increasing the capital gains inclusion rate, which means that builders will pay more tax in capital gains when they go and sell the projects that they built. From an economist's perspective, doesn't that put a damper on risk-taking in terms of building new residential projects? Aside from knowing the details of the legislation, just in principle, as an economist, don't you think that increasing the capital gains tax would make it less likely that someone might build an apartment building or attractive homes?
We certainly know right now in the industry that that development charges are a very big component. Some cite anywhere from 20 to 30% of the cost of new supply, and so that certainly, as a big chunk of what it costs to build, has been a deterrent to new supply.
Mr. Kavich, maybe I'll try the same question with you. Do you think the increase in the capital gains inclusion rate will lead to more or less investment in home building?
Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. So in the context of overall investment activity within real estate, there is potentially an impact either when sellers look to list properties in advance of a tax change, or if the long-term economics of a tax increase alter the expectations of return going forward. So whether, and I personally haven't seen the exact details of the legislation either, so I don't want to comment too deeply on it. Also, real estate's a very long-dated asset, so the impact may or may not be as significant as in some other asset classes. And more broadly speaking, I think as an investment asset class today, macroeconomic conditions are playing the overriding factor here because interest rates have increased, expectations of house price growth have decreased, and current levels of rental yield don't stack up very well to risk-free government assets. So as an investment asset class today, real estate has kind of fallen back in terms of overall activity. So how a capital gains tax change fits in that broader context of weakening activity already would be very hard to flesh out and put a precise estimate on, I would think.
Okay, well, let me ask you a question maybe a little bit of a different way. If you were going to advise the government on the type of policy they should bring in to deal with the housing crisis, which is what this committee is studying right now and is why you're here, would you suggest to them that increasing the capital gains tax would be one of those policies?
I don't, Mr. Speaker, with all honest here, I don't want to project the impact of a specific tax measure that I haven't fully studied in this context.
Okay, Mr. Sondy, quickly with you, same question. Do you think that increase in the capital gains inclusion rate will lead to more or less investment in home building?
Yeah, so we wrote on this. We released a report that was sort of a fulsome take on the latest federal housing plan, and the capital gains inclusion rate was rolled into that report. And in it, we said that the impact would be highly uncertain. It's difficult to know now because we don't know. We don't have a line of sight with respect to how the legislation will be fully rolled out. But there's some risk that it'll be a negative factor for investment moving forward, which would potentially weigh on rental supply. That's a potential impact. Again, we have to wait to see how the details sort of roll out and wait to see how the market reacts to the information. In the resale market, our thought was that it could cause a near-term boost in listings and supply as potential sellers work to get ahead of the June 25th deadline, which could supply some modest downward pressure on average home prices in the near term.
Thank you.
Moran?
In your view, could you speak to the committee and certainly Canadians about your perspective on what led to the housing crisis and the different elements that we need to address in order to move through this predicament? And in a specific lens with the elements is also the all-of-government approach, one being the focus on labor force and really expanding skill sets in the housing construction sector. Thank you.
Right. And this housing crisis, has been, I would argue, decades in the making in some parts of the country. Before the pandemic already, there was a tremendous stress in the Toronto and Vancouver area, for example. But what happened during the pandemic is that stress really spread out across Canada. And now you can arguably say that what we have is a national housing crisis and no longer localized. Now, and fundamentally, as was said before, it is an imbalance between demand and supply, and the supply side has been unable to adjust or respond quickly enough to that very strong demand that we've had over the last many years. And so our view is that the policy side should continue to focus, and we're happy to see that all levels of government now are talking about the supply side, but we need to grow the housing stock in Canada to accommodate all that demand. And when I say housing stock here, I mean the entire spectrum. This is not just on the ownership side. This is also on the rental side. This is also on the social housing side. So we need to address this nationwide issue now. On a big push to grow that housing stock to accommodate that demand.
If you could speak to the cultural changes needed to really ensure that we do everything we can to address the housing challenge, but what it looks like in urban areas, how we live in our places, how we look at shared space, how we look at the way that we live within our space. I know I'm running out of time, but a quick answer from both of you around what we need to look at culturally as well to ensure that every Canadian has the right to dignified spaces to live.
Do I go first on this one? I think it, especially in the urban areas, we're talking about more denser housing, and that means the more housing in terms of footprint, so a higher in addressing the missing middle, so kind of a mid-size housing, so space will be more limited. And this is where I think Canadians, especially in urban areas, will have to adjust their housing expectations.
If I can just very briefly pick up on that, I think, one is, first of all, using the footprint that we have already, and that builds on the densification, but also the infrastructure that's out there. I think we also have to figure out, we are a very decentralized country, and so we have to figure out how to make that work, because a lot of the needs are going to be local and that, on the ground, that's where, whether it's even local government or local nonprofits that are going to be able to best identify the specific needs and their culturally appropriate needs. So I those would be two quick thoughts.
Is there, I think, a sound policy basis to try to curb this trend towards increasing financialization of housing? That's really what my specific question is.
I think that we should be looking at how to leverage capital markets to build more housing supply across the spectrum, and that we also need to have a very focused, specific strategy at the social end because it isn't driven by market forces. And I do see a role that a number of these aging structures are with REIT companies, and so I think that there is a role to to harness.
Now, your quote was market price housing will likely never be affordable for a serious share of households. That was your quote in your 2023 report. Can you quantify that for me, please? What's a serious share of households?
Sorry, apologies.
Oh, I was just going to say, how many are we talking about?
Yeah, thank you. And Mr. Chair, so in this report, what I looked at was the income quintile renters. So the really acute situation right now are in renters because normally in an economic cycle, what happens, when home prices, interest rates are high, we see more people going into rent, and rent is a more kind of a relief valve. It's a cheaper option. But what is very unique about this cycle is that rent, because of that population influx, hasn't been that relief valve. And so, so consequently, where the real vulnerability and the affordability crunches are in those renter Canadians. I quantified it looking at the bottom two income quintile renters. So if you think a third of, Canadians are renters, well, 2/5 of that, so we are, and those tend to be, a third of those. So it is a material number of Canadians, and it is the ones that are not securely attached to the workforce. So that
right. I probably should have continued your quote. You said, and easily those in the lowest income quintile, based on current trajectories, you've now raised sort of maybe the two lowest income quintiles. So are we talking 40% of Canadians?
It's sorry, a third. We're talking more, about 10%. I think is a good number. That is a number that would be classified as core housing need. So 10% of Canadian households.
Okay.
Ms. Young, I'd just like to put actually a quote that you gave on a podcast not too long ago, and just want to make sure you agree with it. It's specifically with respect to the capital gains. You seemed unwilling to go into those waters, despite my question or Mr. Moran's questions, but you did before, and I just wanted to confirm that you feel the same way. You said, and I quote here. And yet we have measures like this that are clearly punitive to investment in Canada. You're talking about capital gains. So it is a big change. And the signal probably doesn't sit well with a lot of folks in terms of what it means for competitiveness and agility of Canada's landscape. Do you still agree with those comments?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. And yes, I still agree with those. I agree with my other colleagues' comments made as well. First of all, situating in the bigger picture of what are creating some of the headwinds and the uncertainty around it. I'd also go back to my, opening points about seeing housing as a system. And this is one example where, we do need to look overall at our tax structure.
Thank you. My time is limited, especially since I'm splitting with Mr. Epp. But I just want to, if I could just get a brief answer to this, do you believe, as I do, that a capital gains taxation is unhelpful? A capital gains increase is unhelpful?
I think certainly the signal is negative, in that we need to look more broadly at our tax system to reorient it towards growth enhancements.
Thank you, Ms. Young. I'll give the rest of my time over to Mr.
Epp. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And at this time, I'd like to move the following motion: that the committee order a fully redacted copy, the government's economic analysis on the impact of the federal fuel charge and the output-based pricing system, referred as Reference Information Request IR0776, in the Department of Environment and Climate Change's Canada's letter to the parliamentary officer dated May 14th, 2024. And, given that this information is already produced, the committee order this file within 24 hours of this motion being adopted and report this finding to the House. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Thank you. MP Epp, and they've got MP Lawrence, then MP Baker to speak to this.
Thank you. And I'm hoping this will be a relatively quick discussion and we can move to a vote and carry forward with what I believe has been some excellent testimony. Of course, we heard in conversation or in discussion with Mr. Yves Giroux, the parliamentary budget officer, that in fact there exists a report that, at least in accordance with Mr. Giroux's comments, would validate his findings that 6 out of 10 Canadians are paying more into the carbon tax than receiving. I should point out that the Liberals do say 8 out of 10, but they only tell half the story, as is often the case. That 8 out of 10 is only with respect to financial or direct payments. When taken in account the economic or the indirect payments, and by what do we mean by that? We mean the cost the carbon tax adds to trucking the food, that adds to farmers, that all funnel its way down to eventually the Canadian consumer, that, as Mr. Giroux said, the majority of Canadians will face a net loss. And one question as to, of course, he did make a clarification on the 17th, and when asked by the PS, the Parliamentary Secretary for Finance, how he knew that his numbers were correct, he said, well, they were the same as yours, which was quite telling. And then Mr. Morantz, an excellent round of questions, asked him to confirm that there was a report. He confirmed that there was a report, and further, he went as far enough to say that there was a gag order which restricted him from providing the full analysis. So, you know what? I haven't.
Au règlement, Monsieur le Président.
C'est quoi ce gag order? J'ai oublié.
Étant donné.
Point of order. The number of given the amount of people that would like to speak on the motion, I'm asking to free the witnesses.
I move that we adjourn debate.
Okay, there's ask for adjournment debate. So, clerk, if you can poll the members.
Mr. Baker. In favor.
Ms. Zerowitz.
Adjourned debate.
Mr. Sorbara.
In favor of adjourning debate.
Ms. Thompson.
Adjourned debate.
Ms. Brière.
Adjourned debate.
Mr. Chambers.
No.
Mr. Epp.
No.
Mr. Lawrence.
No.
Mr. Morantz.
Definitely not.
Monsieur Sainte-Marie.
Contre.
Mr. Davies.
Yes.
Yeas pour 6, nays contre 5, 5.
Okay, so debate is adjourned, and members, we have released the witnesses, so shall we adjourn? Yes, yeah, okay, we're adjourned.